Settlers mocked his fool's bare fence. In 2 hours, at 2 in the morning, they would understand why every wire mattered. The massive creature stalking their settlement was already circling their defenses, and Tobias Henriksen knew it would test every weakness. What the townspeople didn't realize was that he had built this barrier not just to keep something out, but to survive what was coming. Tonight, when the temperature dropped below freezing and the wind carried the scent of human fear, the predator would come, and Tobias would be ready. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the settlement as Magnus Cray stormed toward the construction site, his boots crunching through patches of snow that refused to melt. Half the town followed behind him, their faces tight with the kind of anger that comes from watching precious resources disappear into what looked like madness. The fence stretched 8 feet high around the settlement's perimeter, each metal post driven deep enough to withstand the strongest gales that swept down from the northern peaks. "Henriksen!" Magnus shouted, his voice echoing off the surrounding cabins. "This ends today. We're taking that wire for the schoolhouse roof before the next storm hits." Tobias paused in connecting the final electrical components. A black control box that hummed with barely contained power. His weathered hands moved with the precision of a man who had performed this exact task before, in another place, under circumstances that haunted his dreams. "You'll need more than a new roof when what I've been tracking finally arrives." Willem Hart stepped forward, emboldened by the crowd's support. "Tracking what? We haven't seen so much as a rabbit track in weeks." Elena Voss hung back from the group, studying Tobias's face for signs of the trauma she had heard whispers about. The loss of his brother's family up north, the way he had arrived at their settlement 3 months ago, with nothing but tools and terrible knowledge. She watched him reach into a leather satchel and withdraw something that made the angry voices fall silent. The bear claw was longer than a man's thumb, curved like a sickle, and marked with fresh gouges that suggested it had been torn from its owner recently. But it was the size that stopped conversations mid-sentence. No animal they knew could grow claws that massive. "Found this yesterday pressed into the mud behind the Hansen cabin," Tobias said quietly. "The prints around it measured 14 inches across. Whatever left this has been watching us, learning our routines, waiting for the right moment." Magnus grabbed the claw, turning it over in hands that suddenly seemed smaller. "This could be from any old carcass. Bears die in the wilderness all the time. The blood on it is 3 hours old." Tobias pointed toward the tree line, where afternoon shadows were already deepening toward evening. "And the tracks lead straight back to where it's been sleeping during the day, about 2 miles north in the old logging camp where my brother's family was found." The weight of those words settled over the crowd like gathering storm clouds. Everyone knew the stories from up north, the trading post that had gone silent, the trappers who simply vanished between one supply run and the next. Elena was the first to notice Tobias's hands trembling as he held the massive claw. Not from cold, but from memory. She had seen that same shake in survivors before, the involuntary response to trauma that never fully healed. Whatever had happened up north, whatever he had witnessed at that logging camp, it was about to happen again. And this time, he was the only thing standing between 23 families and something that killed for sport. The crowd began to disperse as darkness crept closer, but Magnus remained planted in front of the fence, his authority challenged by evidence he couldn't dismiss. "Even if there is something out there, this contraption won't stop a determined predator. You're wasting generator fuel we need for heating. The current running through these wires will drop a charging bull," Tobias replied, adjusting dials on the control box with movements that suggested intimate familiarity with electrical systems. 15,000 volts, pulsed in 3-second intervals to conserve power. Willem laughed nervously, the sound brittle in the gathering dusk. "You're talking about electrifying our entire perimeter. What happens if a child touches it? What happens if someone needs to get out quickly?" Tobias pointed to a series of switches mounted near each cabin. "Emergency shutoffs. Every family has control over their section." He paused, meeting Elena's eyes across the small crowd. "But once we activate this system, no one leaves their cabin until sunrise, no matter what they hear outside." The implications of that statement settled over them like a physical weight. Magnus stepped closer to the fence, studying the intricate wiring that created a barrier unlike anything their frontier settlement had ever needed. "How do you know so much about electrical systems, Henriksen? Most folks out here can barely keep a lantern burning." For the first time since arriving at their settlement, Tobias's carefully controlled expression cracked. Pain flickered across his features, raw and immediate. My brother was an engineer. He taught me everything about power systems before he took his family north to establish that trading post. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. I helped him design their defenses. Thought I had made them safe. Elena felt something cold settle in her stomach. What happened to their defenses? They failed. Tobias began packing his tools with mechanical precision, each movement an obvious effort to maintain composure. But not because of poor design. They failed because we underestimated what we were trying to keep out. He gestured toward the darkening forest. The creature that's been watching us is different from anything in the natural order. Bigger, smarter, more persistent than any bear species recorded in these territories. Magnus scoffed, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. You're asking us to believe in some kind of monster. I'm asking you to believe in 15 years of practical experience with large predators, and 3 months of tracking something that shouldn't exist. Tobias shouldered his tool bag and walked toward the control box. The choice is yours, Magnus. Power the fence and trust that I know what's coming, or leave it dead and hope that I'm wrong. The settlement leader looked toward the tree line, where the first stars were becoming visible through gathering clouds. Temperature was dropping fast, and the wind carried scents that seemed somehow different than usual. More urgent, more dangerous. Elena made the decision for all of them. How long before it comes? Tobias checked the horizon, calculating time and temperature with the accuracy of a man whose life had once depended on such predictions. 2 hours, maybe less. Elena's decision to trust Tobias triggered something Magnus hadn't anticipated. Within minutes, families began emerging from their cabins carrying whatever supplies they could spare. Anna Richardson brought rope and lanterns. The Harper brothers carried ammunition for the 3 rifles in town. Even Willem, despite his earlier mockery, appeared with his father's hunting knife and a grim expression that suggested he was beginning to understand the gravity of their situation. But it was what Tobias pulled from his cabin that made everyone stop talking. The wooden crate he carried required both hands, and when he set it down near the control box, the metallic rattle from inside suggested serious preparation. Elena watched him remove items one by one, each object telling a story of survival planning that went far beyond normal frontier caution. Emergency medical supplies, military-grade field dressings, morphine vials that cost more than most families saw in a year, and photographs, dozens of them, wrapped in oiled cloth and bound with string that had been untied many times before. These are from the logging camp, Tobias said quietly, holding up the first photograph. The image showed massive claw marks gouged into the side of a wooden building, splinters scattered across snow that was stained dark in several places. This was my brother's workshop after the first attack. Magnus studied the photograph with growing unease. The claw marks were spaced too far apart for any normal animal, and they had torn through wood that was 3 inches thick. What kind of bear could do that level of damage? That's what we thought it was. Initially, Tobias showed them the next photograph, this one depicting tracks in snow that dwarfed the boot prints beside them. We measured these at 16 inches across, front to back. The stride pattern indicated something weighing close to 1,500 pounds. Moving at full speed. Elena felt her stomach tighten. How do you know all those details? Because I lived through it. Tobias's voice carried the weight of memory that had been carried too long alone. I was visiting for 3 weeks, helping them establish defenses against normal predators. We thought we were dealing with a rogue grizzly, maybe one driven out of its territory by younger males. He set down another photograph, this one showing deep grooves in the ground where something massive had dragged an object toward the tree line. We were wrong. Willem backed away from the photographs, his face pale in the lantern light. Those drag marks. What was it pulling? My nephew's sled. He had been playing outside when we heard the first roar. Tobias reached for another photograph, then stopped himself, as if some images were too painful to share even now. The sound wasn't like any animal vocalization we had ever heard. It was intelligent, calculated, designed to create maximum fear. The settlement fell silent except for the wind moving through the surrounding trees. Elena noticed that the temperature had dropped significantly since they had begun talking, and their breath now formed visible clouds with every word. Magnus cleared his throat, struggling to maintain his leadership role in the face of evidence that challenged everything he thought he knew about frontier survival. Even if this creature exists, even if it's as dangerous as you claim, what makes you think it will come here? Tobias pointed toward the tree line, where shadows were deepening into complete darkness. Because it's been hunting systematically. moving south from one settlement to the next. The trading post was first, then the Miller homestead, 20 miles closer to us, then the Garrison family's ranch, just 10 miles north. He began loading his emergency supplies back into the crate with methodical precision. Each attack happened on the coldest night of the month, always between midnight and dawn, always when the wind was calm enough to carry scent over long distances. Elena checked the sky, where clouds were gathering in formations that suggested falling temperatures ahead. And tonight? Tonight is the coldest we've seen in 6 weeks. The temperature dropped 12 degrees in the next hour. Elena watched families secure their cabins with the kind of methodical urgency that came from accepting a threat they didn't fully understand. Children were brought inside despite their protests. Livestock was moved to the central barn where multiple escape routes had been hastily cleared, and everyone checked their emergency shutdown switches twice, knowing that 15,000 volts could save them or kill them, depending on how quickly they could react. Tobias moved from cabin to cabin, testing electrical connections with instruments that seemed far too sophisticated for frontier living. Elena followed, partly to help, but mostly because his technical knowledge raised questions that demanded answers. The man installing their defense system had engineering skills that belonged in a city, not a wilderness settlement. "Where did you learn electrical work?" she asked as he adjusted voltage levels on the Richardson family's shutdown box. "In Eastern City. Worked for the electrical works for 8 years before my brother convinced me to move west." His hands moved with the confidence of someone who had spent years working with dangerous current levels. Never thought those skills would be needed for something like this. Anna Richardson emerged from her cabin carrying a bundle that made Elena's heart sink. Baby clothes, carefully wrapped and placed in a travel bag that suggested preparation for the worst possible outcome. If something happens tonight, if that fence doesn't hold, how long do we have to get the children out? Tobias paused in his work, and Elena saw him calculate odds that no one should have to consider. If the barrier fails completely, maybe 30 seconds before it reaches the central cabins. But Mrs. Richardson, if this creature is what I think it is, running won't be an option. The only safety is behind these wires. Magnus approached carrying the settlement's emergency communication device, its antenna extended toward the cloudy sky. "I've been trying to reach the territorial garrison for the past hour. Nothing but static." He set the device down with more force than necessary. "We're completely isolated until the next supply run, which isn't for another week. The interference isn't an accident," Tobias said quietly, connecting the final wire to the main control system. "Large predators can sense electromagnetic fields. Some actively avoid them, but others are drawn to the static." He gestured toward the device that now hummed with barely contained power. "This barrier will either repel it completely or attract it directly to us." Willem laughed, but the sound carried no humor. "So we're either completely safe or completely doomed, and we won't know which until it's too late to change our minds." "That's an accurate assessment." Tobias walked to the central control box, his hand hovering over the master switch that would energize their entire perimeter. "Once this system is active, there's no going back. The power draw will drain our generator reserves in 6 hours maximum." Elena felt the weight of that timeline settle over them like a burial shroud. 6 hours. If the creature didn't come tonight, they would be left defenseless tomorrow night with no power reserves for a second attempt. Everything depended on Tobias's certainty about timing and patterns. "How can you be so sure it will come tonight?" Magnus demanded. Tobias pulled out his final photograph, one he had kept separate from the others. The image showed his brother's family gathered around their dinner table, smiling at the camera, with the kind of happiness that came from building something meaningful together. Because this was taken the night before they died, the temperature dropped exactly like this. The wind patterns were identical, and at 10 minutes past 2 in the morning something began testing their defenses. A sound from the forest made everyone freeze. Not quite a roar, not quite a growl, but something that carried intelligence and intent across the distance between the tree line and their fragile circle of light. It lasted only seconds, but in those moments, every doubt about Tobias's warnings evaporated. "That was just a warning," he said calmly, activating the master switch. "It's telling us that it knows we're here." The electric fence hummed to life with a sound that seemed to vibrate through the ground itself. Elena felt it in her teeth, a constant reminder that 15,000 volts now surrounded their settlement like an invisible wall of death. Every cabin window showed the yellow glow of lanterns as families gathered in their central rooms. away from exterior walls that might not withstand what was coming. Tobias positioned himself at the control station, surrounded by instruments that measured voltage, current flow, and power consumption, with the precision of someone who understood that technical failure meant human death. Elena joined him there, partly because she wanted to help, but mostly because watching his hands work the controls kept her mind occupied with something other than the sounds coming from the forest. The creature was moving, not just making noise but actively circling their perimeter at a distance that suggested intelligence and planning. Elena tracked its progress by the way distant branches snapped and snow crunched under tremendous weight. Whatever stalked them understood defensive barriers and was conducting reconnaissance before launching its assault. "How much does it weigh?" she asked, studying the voltage readouts that showed their power reserves dropping steadily, even with the fence at normal operating capacity. Based on the track measurements and structural damage from previous attacks, somewhere between 12 and 1,500 pounds. Tobias adjusted a dial that increased the pulse frequency, sending more frequent jolts through the wire mesh. "But size isn't what makes it dangerous. The intelligence is what killed my family." Magnus emerged from his cabin carrying the settlement's emergency medical kit, his face grim with the realization that preparation for injury was as important as prevention. "How intelligent are we talking about?" "It understands cause and effect. It learns from observation. And it adapts to defensive measures faster than any natural predator should be capable of." Tobias pointed toward the tree line, where something large was testing the flexibility of branches that would support its weight for surveillance. "Right now it's studying our barrier, looking for weaknesses, calculating the safest approach vector." Elena checked her pocket watch by lantern light, noting how the numbers seemed to mock their situation with mathematical precision. 11:47. In 1 hour and 23 minutes, Tobias's predictions would either save their lives or prove catastrophically wrong. The margin for error had narrowed to a timeline that offered no second chances. Willem appeared at the control station carrying rope and climbing gear that suggested he had been planning escape routes despite Tobias's warnings about running. "What happens if the fence fails?" "Then we find out how much faith we have in our cabin construction." Tobias opened a metal case that contained backup components and emergency shutoff switches. "But the fence won't fail unless our power supply is interrupted or something cuts through the main lines." A sound from the western perimeter made everyone freeze, not the careful movement they had been tracking, but something deliberate and metallic. The unmistakable sound of wire being tested, probed, examined by something that understood the relationship between electrical current and physical contact. "It's learning the fence layout," Elena whispered, hardly daring to breathe. Tobias nodded grimly, his eyes fixed on voltage monitors that showed slight fluctuations as the creature investigated their defenses. "At the logging camp, my brother thought he had built an impregnable barrier. Steel posts, double-thick wire, enough current to stop a charging buffalo." His voice carried the weight of absolute certainty born from witnessing failure. "It took the creature exactly 37 minutes to find the weak point." Elena's watch showed 11:59. "How long do we have?" 11 minutes. 2 in the morning arrived with the precision of a death sentence. Elena's watch showed the exact minute when the forest fell completely silent, as if every living creature had retreated from something too dangerous to witness. The electric fence continued its steady hum, but the voltage monitors began showing irregular readings that suggested something massive was approaching the perimeter. Tobias stood motionless at the control station, his eyes fixed on instruments that measured electrical resistance across the fence line. Elena watched the needles flutter with growing anxiety, each fluctuation indicating that their barrier was being tested by something that understood the relationship between metal and electrical current. "There," Tobias whispered, pointing toward the northwestern section where voltage levels showed a sudden spike followed by immediate stabilization. "It just made contact." The sound that followed defied every assumption Elena had carried about animal behavior. Not a roar of pain or surprise, but a deliberate vocalization that suggested the creature was communicating with itself, processing information about the nature of their defenses. The intelligence behind that sound made her blood run cold. Magnus emerged from his cabin despite strict instructions to remain inside, drawn by curiosity that overrode common sense. "What's it doing?" "Learning." Tobias adjusted power flow to compensate for the drain created by sustained contact with the fence. "It's determining exactly how much current runs through each section, mapping our defensive capabilities before committing to a full assault." The creature moved along their perimeter with methodical precision, testing voltage levels at dozen-yard intervals while voltage monitors registered each contact point. Elena realized they were witnessing something unprecedented in predator behavior, an animal that approached human defenses with the systematic intelligence of an engineer conducting field research. "This is impossible," Willem breathed from his cabin doorway. "Wild animals don't behave like this. This isn't a wild animal in any conventional sense." Tobias increased power output to maximum sustainable levels, sending 20,000 volts through wire that began to glow faintly in the darkness. "This is an apex predator that has learned to hunt human settlements specifically." The voltage monitors suddenly spiked to maximum readings as something struck the fence with tremendous force. The impact created a brilliant flash of electrical discharge that illuminated the entire settlement for 3 seconds, revealing a silhouette that challenged every assumption about natural predator size limitations. Elena caught her breath at what the light revealed. The creature testing their defenses stood nearly 9 feet tall at the shoulder, covered in white fur that seemed to absorb and reflect electrical energy like some kind of natural insulation system. Its massive head turned toward their control station, with eyes that reflected intelligence far beyond normal animal cognition. "Polar bear," Magnus whispered, his voice carrying the kind of awe reserved for witnessing something that belonged in legends rather than frontier reality. "Polar bear that weighs close to 2,000 pounds and has learned to hunt human settlements," Tobias corrected grimly. "And it just discovered that our fence delivers enough current to be annoying, but not lethal." The creature backed away from the wire, but instead of retreating, it began circling their perimeter again, this time moving faster and with obvious purpose. Elena realized with growing horror that their defensive barrier had just become a challenge to be overcome rather than a deterrent to be respected. "It's looking for our weak point," she said, watching voltage readings fluctuate as the creature tested different sections of fence with increasing aggression. Tobias nodded, his hands moving across controls with the desperate precision of someone who understood that technical expertise was their only advantage against something that outweighed them by factors they couldn't overcome through conventional means. "And it's going to find one." Elena's watch showed 2:07 when the creature found exactly what it had been searching for. The ground connection failed at exactly 2:09. Elena watched the voltage monitors drop to 0 across the northwestern section as the massive polar bear systematically destroyed the buried grounding wire that completed their electrical circuit. Sparks erupted from damaged connections, but without proper ground continuity, 20,000 volts became nothing more than an expensive light show. Tobias moved with the calm precision of someone who had planned for this exact failure. He opened a secondary control box that Elena hadn't noticed before, revealing backup systems that suggested his engineering background included military applications. "Everyone get to your emergency positions." Now, the creature pushed through the dead section of fence like walking through spiderwebs, its massive frame moving with surprising grace for something that weighed more than 10 men. Elena realized with crystal clarity that every story about polar bear intelligence had been understated. This animal understood electrical systems well enough to target the most vulnerable component first. Magnus emerged from his cabin carrying the settlement's only rifle, a weapon that seemed laughably inadequate against something that stood 9 feet tall at the shoulder. "Tobias, that fence was our only defense. What's your backup plan?" Instead of answering, Tobias activated a series of switches that sent power flowing toward devices Elena hadn't seen him install. Suddenly, the settlement's perimeter erupted in blinding white light as emergency illumination devices powered by separate power systems flooded the entire area with the intensity of daylight. The polar bear stopped moving, temporarily disoriented by the sudden elimination of its natural hunting darkness. "Light is the only advantage we have," Tobias explained, adjusting the beam angles to eliminate shadows where something massive could hide. "Polar bears are ambush predators that rely on stealth and darkness. Force it to attack under full illumination, and it loses most of its tactical advantages." Elena understood immediately. The creature had spent weeks studying their settlement under cover of darkness, learning routines and defensive positions while remaining essentially invisible. But flooded with artificial daylight, it became a white target against dark forest background, visible from every angle. The polar bear adapted faster than anyone expected. Instead of retreating, it charged directly toward the central cabins with the kind of focused aggression that suggested it understood the relationship between light sources and electrical vulnerability. Elena realized that destroying the generators would restore the darkness it needed for successful predation. "It's going for the power supply," she shouted, watching the massive creature cover ground with strides that measured 8 feet from back paw to front paw. Tobias pulled one final device from his backup kit, something that looked like an emergency flare but carried warning labels that suggested far more serious applications. "Everyone cover your ears and close your eyes. This is going to be extremely loud." Magnus grabbed Elena's arm, pulling her toward the nearest cabin as Tobias activated whatever specialized device he had been saving for this exact moment. "What is that thing?" "Emergency wildlife deterrent," Tobias replied grimly, pulling the activation cord. "Designed for situations where conventional methods have failed completely." The explosion that followed shook every building in the settlement and sent the polar bear tumbling backward across 20 yards of snow-covered ground. Elena's ears rang with a sound that seemed to echo inside her skull, but through the ringing she heard something that made her heart race with desperate hope. The creature was retreating, moving away from the settlement with the kind of urgent speed that suggested genuine fear rather than tactical repositioning. Dawn broke over a settlement that had survived what should have been impossible. Elena stood beside Tobias at the damaged fence line, studying massive paw prints in the snow that led directly away from their community and disappeared into the forest beyond. The emergency flare had done more than create noise and light. It had convinced a 2,000-pound predator that easier prey existed elsewhere. Magnus approached them carrying tools for fence repair, his expression carrying the kind of respect that came from witnessing expertise save lives. "That explosive device, where did you get military-grade wildlife deterrents?" "Designed them myself during my engineering years. Never thought I'd need them twice." Tobias examined the damaged grounding wire that had nearly cost them everything. "My brother didn't have access to those devices when his family was attacked. I've carried them ever since, hoping I would never need to use them." Elena helped him coil the damaged electrical cable, noting how his hands no longer trembled when discussing his family's fate. Saving their settlement had given him the closure that 3 months of guilt and preparation hadn't provided. "How do you know it won't come back?" "Polar bears are intelligent enough to remember negative experiences and avoid repeating them. That flare created a psychological association between our settlement and serious pain." Tobias pointed toward the retreating tracks, which showed the creature had maintained maximum speed for over a mile before slowing to normal travel pace. "It will find hunting grounds that don't require overcoming prepared defenses." Willem emerged from his cabin carrying breakfast for the repair crew. His attitude toward Tobias transformed completely from mockery to genuine admiration. "I owe you an apology. We all do. If we had listened to you from the beginning, we wouldn't have wasted so much time arguing about fence construction." Anna Richardson joined them with her baby, no longer wrapped for emergency evacuation but dressed for a normal day in a settlement that had proven its ability to defend itself. "How did you know exactly when it would attack?" "Polar bears are creatures of habit when hunting is successful. They repeat patterns that work until something forces them to adapt." Tobias began planning repairs that would restore their electrical defenses within 2 days. Temperature, wind conditions, and timing all factor into their hunting behavior. "Once I identified the pattern from previous attacks, predicting the next one became a matter of environmental calculation." Magnus set down his tools and extended his hand toward Tobias with the formality of someone acknowledging leadership they should have recognized much earlier. "I think it's time we asked you to take charge of our defensive planning on a permanent basis. You've proven you understand threats that the rest of us can't even recognize." Elena watched Tobias consider the offer with the kind of careful thought he applied to all technical problems. The man who had arrived 3 months ago carrying nothing but tools and terrible knowledge had become the person their community turned to for survival expertise they hadn't known they needed. "I'll stay," Tobias agreed, shaking Magnus's hand with genuine warmth. "But we rebuild the fence properly this time. Redundant power supplies, multiple grounding systems, and emergency protocols that everyone understands completely." Elena smiled as the settlement began organizing repair crews with the kind of cooperative efficiency that came from shared survival experiences. They had learned the hard way that preparation wasn't paranoia, and expertise wasn't something to be mocked when lives hung in the balance. The fence that had been called foolish by everyone who saw it had saved 23 families from a predator that conventional wisdom claimed didn't exist. And the man they had dismissed as overly cautious had proven that sometimes the most important thing you could do was be right when everyone else was wrong. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale from the frontier, where courage and cunning face off against impossible odds. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.